Welcome to Small Spark Theory. This podcast is designed as a collection of thoughts, ideas, and practical tips on using marginal gains to help your agency new business endeavours. Small Spark Theory is created and hosted by me, Lucy Mann of Gunpowder Consulting. Welcome back to Small Spark Theory. A small disclaimer about this episode. For those of you looking for really practical new business tips, this is going to be a slightly different kind of episode. So if this is not your thing, you might just want to come back and see us next month. But this time, we're going to be talking about fear. So we're going to be getting a little bit in touch with our feelings and lifting the lid on when fear gets in the way of all of those new business and growth activities that we fundamentally need to do. Some of you may recall we spoke to Hilary Gallo in an episode last year talking about negotiation and his book, The Power of Soft. Since then, Hilary's written another book called Fear Hack. So I really wanted to invite Hilary back to come and talk to us about fear and find out the secret to fear hacking. So, Hilary, I'm delighted to welcome you back and help us lift the lid on what's causing all of our fears.
Thank you, Lucy. No, I'm delighted to.
Well, you're most welcome. It would be lovely to understand. So for any of those listeners that didn't catch the earlier episode, and I'll include a link through so that people can go back if they missed the negotiation episode. What was your sort of impetus after that to then write about fear?
That's a good question. I think in negotiation, I'm encouraged. I've always found that it's good to ask what sits beneath something. And that's essentially what happened here. I asked myself, what's the substrata of the problems I was seeing in negotiation? And as I increasingly, it's all very well you write a book, but then you go out and talk about it. And it's quite a revealing experience because I realised as I was talking about the principles in the book, one of the things I kept coming up was the question of fear. And I realised that in negotiation, fear actually drives a lot of the bad behaviour we're trying to get away from. So if you're in fear, and it's not necessarily fear of something big like a tiger or a physical existential sort of threat, it's more fear of uncertainty, fear of losing your job, fear of what your boss might say, all these sort of things. When you're in fear, you get stuck, you get positional, you get locked into where you are, and you stop moving, you stop flexing, you stop growing possibility. And I think it's the same in life. I've kind of realised that actually that's what happens to us in our career terms and becomes our lives. The more fearful we get, the more stuck we get. And so I think it's a question that came up through negotiation lens. But then I realised, this is actually something that's powerful for me because it's been getting me stuck in my life. Whenever I've struggled, whenever I've found things difficult, it's been because I'm fearful of something. So it's that joining together this as an inquiry about what is it that sits beneath this problem that I'm seeing, and then throwing a bit of my own personal experience in it. And then I think there's also an element from my background in negotiation, which is the realisation that you have to go towards the enemy, in inverted commas. The thing that you don't want to go towards, you kind of have to go towards. You can't just spend your time, moving away or avoiding that big, hairy, horrible monster thing, whatever it is, that you don't want to approach. Actually, the best solution is to walk up to it and look it in the eye. And that's kind of what I learned I had to do in negotiation. You asked the question, what took me here, but it's also what's guided me, is very much this feeling that I had to make fear my friend. It wasn't about just beating it. It was about actually using it and welcoming it as a resource.
Great. So your book, Fear Hack,
Yep.
is out, and we'll be providing a link to that. And I know that you've been running fear hacking workshops, and I think you did that at the Do lectures.
Yes.
And I know that you've been doing quite a lot specifically with creative agencies.
Yeah.
So I was really interested, with me thinking very much about agency growth and new business and all of those things that I've witnessed, and the paralysis that comes with fear that stops people doing the things that would benefit the business and benefit the people. I wondered where the common themes were that you experienced with the agencies that you've been working with in those workshops?
The thing that I would say is I think fear is, because it's a creature of the mind. One of the things I've noticed is that it affects those of us whose careers and occupation, our time is spent in creative endeavour. I think if you spend all day working, you're laying bricks or you're doing something highly physical, and you're physically exhausted at the end of the day, I think your usage of your mind is different. You're engaging in the physical world, and I think you just probably you go home tired of the physical world and you sleep very well and all these things. But I think what I've seen is it's fundamentally different if you spend your life being creative and imaginative, because you're using the positive side of your imagination, your ability to be able to imagine things as they might be, which is a superpower. But we've got to accept, with that amazing superpower to imagine things as they might positively become, we've also got this element which is, well, what if it went the other way? What if we could use that same wonderful capacity to take ourselves in a positive possibility in a negative direction? And that's where fear kind of grows and resides, is this negative side of that positive, fantastic part of being creative. Yeah. So it's not so much that I've seen a trend that's anything particular to the creative field. It's more that this is, I think, a particular issue for those of us who live creative lives, because we have very active imagination. That's our great source of joy, but it's also if we can't manage it. So this is about actually how can we help ourselves with a bit of self-care. So it ties into mindfulness and all this. How do we help ourselves in a more positive way? How can we listen and make, know when that wonderful creative mind is taking us to a place that's not helpful?
Okay, well, we're going to give you some real live examples today. This is going to be a bit like therapy. Izzy, our lovely producer Izzy, is here with us in the studio today. Izzy, what have been your challenges with fear?
Okay, so this is a big one.
Yeah.
I think most people have had this problem. It's about money. So asking for pay rises is probably the most scary thing, and I don't know why I find it so terrifying, but asking for money in a new business capacity, not terrifying at all. Not scared of doing that. I've been an agent. I've worked in new business before as well, and I don't know why it becomes, because it's about you. I don't know whether that's a personal thing, but some advice on that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
One of the things I do in the fear hack is the thing that's been really powerful is to have a fear wall, to get people to name stuff and put it on the wall. And I've always been surprised at the depth of conversation that comes out of what you'd think would be quite simplistic. And the thing that's a consistent theme that I'd kind of apply to this is the fact that actually when you put that stuff up there and you look at it, and you look at everyone's, the thing that comes through very strongly is the realisation that we don't have much evidence for this stuff. We have a fear. So in those circumstances, we might have a fear of what might happen. Our boss might take against us, or we might, be disciplined, or things might happen. But actually there's no evidence for any of that. And in fact, if we look back and we looked at the other situations in which we'd done that, if we'd asked for a pay rise before, we didn't get fired then, did we? We didn't get a negative response then. And so the first thing I'd say is there's a lot of things that we tend to fear. I would go deeper into what the fear really is. So some of the times we can not do these things, and it's not actually a fear we're naming, it's a strategy to avoid fear.
Oh, interesting.
Which is an important difference. So your fear is not so much the avoidance of the conversation. Your fear is something that lies beneath that. And that fear is probably attached to something, if you inquire further about it, it's probably attached to questions of self-worth and confidence, and and the difference between the agency situation, I think, and the pay rise is that element of that's where the issues about fear, about something that's very personal, are present. So there's some things there that are attached to how you feel about yourself. And one of the things I'm trying to do with Fear Hack, and the hack is very much about how can we reframe that feeling, because we tend to approach these things that we're fearful of in a victim state. So our underlying model tends to be one of victimhood, which I don't think is helpful. So as soon as we put ourselves in that victim state, we're expecting some monster to come and be nasty to us, or be aggressive, or act very negatively upon us. Well, if we can reframe that narrative into one where we actually say, well, I'm actually one of this agency's key employees. I have my strengths. I have this. I have that. If we can reframe that positively in the question of power and see that actually we're a valued member of the team, then those issues of victimhood, or we can reframe how we see our own power. And I think it's that enables us to have a more frank and level conversation. So it's not a sort of hierarchical thing of me as this scared individual having this thing with my great boss. It's more like two equal individuals who exist together cooperatively, who can have a constructive conversation between friends about something that's important to both of us.
That's great. That is good. I think also in quite a lot of creative industries, there's a sort of sense that you should be honoured to work there, and that asking for a pay rise is
Taking the piss.
taking the piss.
Yeah.
I've been reading a lot about it recently, and so many people have said the same sort of thing, that it's like, why do we feel like we should be honoured to work somewhere when really we are an integral part of the team and we should be getting paid well? But that's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I'm interested as well. I'm thinking of your experience working in an agency as an employee, and also how that same fear manifests itself perhaps for the agency owner when they are then negotiating money in a new business scenario.
Yeah.
Because again, it is personal. There isn't that disassociation that so if a new business manager perhaps is pitching for a new client and is talking about money, they have a bit more confidence in the wider business, and it's slightly disassociated. It's not as personal. Whereas for the founder, it absolutely is personal, and there's so much more caught up in that. I mean, I guess we're back to negotiation again, but there's so much more caught up in that if they get it wrong, they could lose the opportunity completely with that prospect, but also they will be failing the rest of the agency. There's salaries to pay. Those employees have got mortgages to pay. So I think there's a lot at stake there, isn't there?
Yeah, I think it's again back to the sort of power balancing question. But there's a bit of Buddhism Zen in this, which is the realization that all suffering comes out of attachment. So the more we attach to an outcome that we seek to impose upon the situation, the more fearful and antagonistic and anxious we're likely to be.
Yeah.
Because what we're not doing is allowing that situation to be what it needs to be. If we go into any situation and we expect a particular outcome from it, we become a controller of that situation and we are imposing stuff on it. We're not going to see the full possibility of what it could be, but also we're going to be more anxious than we need to be. And I think part of this is letting go of stuff. There's a difference to me between attachment and commitment. So what I'd say to people is we need to be absolutely committed to doing an amazing pitch. Absolutely. But if this client doesn't want my agency, or we're just not, there's somebody better, I kind of have to accept that. And I think if we can be committed to being the best we can be and understanding who we are and doing it in our way, that's a far more powerful and free of fear way to be than always going around expecting. If we're highly competitive, the most dangerous thing is to attach to, either an outcome or to compare ourselves to the competition. Because once we do that, it ties straight into all the other issues. Well, why can't we just be the best we can be? There are people out there who will sometimes do smarter things and beat us in a situation because they thought of something clever. Well, our job is to learn from that and to notice and to be aware of that and to inquire about it if it's valuable for us, and to treat that as a learning opportunity and then be better the next time. But I think attaching to having to be better than your competition, that immediately of itself exacerbates the situation.
Interesting,
So-
which is effectively, yes, what our kind of pitching scenario becomes. So,
Well,
yeah,
clients drive that
Yeah.
because they're trying to drive a competition, and but what they're trying to do is diminish your power, because rather than having a situation where they partner successfully with one party to get the best of both the internal and the external, they're running a commodity competition in which they're going to lose something. They're going to gain something in terms of price, perhaps, but there's also a loss. So part of our game, perhaps, is to get into situations where we have more co-creation opportunities with clients, where we can genuinely work together to build something powerful together, rather than having a commodity-driven competition.
Absolutely, and I think it actually goes back to thinking back to the conversations that we had with Blair Enns around pricing and value pricing, and
Yep.
so you get to a point where you're having a deep understanding of the outcomes that you can deliver for a client before you've even thought about price. So it's changing the conversation,
Yeah.
and it becomes less of that kind of beauty parade scenario.
It also shifts the power balance, because
Yeah.
what you're doing is taking the power away from them and building on your own power. And what it's the same as Izzy's situation
Yeah.
of being an employee. We're starting to respect more our own power as an individual or as an agency in that situation. And once we do that, the power we have in that situation shifts.
Interesting. Good. Okay. So thank you for that. I'm now going to share my personal and very real, current and topical fear. So it's public speaking. So
You're not alone there.
I know it's a very, very common thing.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in something you said earlier, because the thing that is difficult for me is the fear of the fear rather than the fear itself. So just about the time I started, a year into my consulting, I started getting invited to do some talks, and did a couple absolutely fine, a little bit nervous but absolutely fine. And then I had one where I didn't feel nervous, arrived, stood at the front of a room of 60 people, and as I started to speak had a full-blown panic attack and got through it. The very polite people I spoke to afterwards said they didn't notice. I think they might have been lying, but I think they were being kind. But for a long time, that was really difficult, because I didn't want to put myself in another situation like that. And I have since done lots of other speaking things with the help of the brilliant Catherine Allison from Master the Art, who gave me lots of amazing kind of breathing techniques if you feel it coming on, to get rid of it, which is great. But I'm now coming up for a couple of months where I've got a ridiculous number of speaking opportunities, having probably not really done very much for the last year. And already I'm feeling anxious that thing is going to kick in again. So it's not the fear, it's the fear of the fear. What's that about?
Well, early on in the workshops, I noticed a difference. Because I started this, I didn't really know that much about fear. And I started to notice straight away a clear difference between two sorts of fears. One of which I call anxiety. So it's much more about, and I think this is where a lot of the work has actually happened recently, is a fear of what might happen in the future. I think that is separate and slightly different from fear in the actual moment.
Yeah.
So let me talk about each slightly separately. The fear of the fear itself in the future, the anxiety, I think can be solved by inquiry and reframing of the narrative about what that thing is, and questioning ourselves about what evidence do we actually have. In your case, you clearly have some evidence, but even that is not evidence that it's ever going to happen again. It's more evidence that it can happen, and if you're not careful about certain things, you have a risk. But it's not evidence that it will happen ever again. So I think there are things you can do about managing that fear as a symptom of your imagination. The other thing that I think is people struggle with equally is the fear in the moment. And I think that is much to do with how we manage our nervous system. So we tend to think about, when we do something like public speaking, we tend to think a lot about the thing we need to do, the speaking, the notes. We worry about going over our presentation and remembering everything and the thing. But I think what we don't spend enough time doing is thinking about our state.
breathing.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's exactly the point, because if you are in a fundamentally good place in your nervous system, you will be able to handle anything. If you have if your nervous system is relaxed, it doesn't matter what that audience throws at you, because you will see everything, even the difficult questions. You won't respond to them as a victim. You'll respond to them as a empowered, caring, soul.
Okay.
And there's a difference, because as soon as we're thrown into victim state, we're fighting. There's a fight or flight thing, and our nervous system has panicked. So my tips, I think of this as a traffic light system.
Okay.
And I literally think of this as being red of the traffic light for freeze and absolute panic.
Yeah.
Panic attack, where the worst of it, we freeze up and we can't move. The amber is fight flight, and the green is safe.
Okay.
And I think if we can get ourselves in green in front of an audience, if we can get ourselves in that safe state, we perform so much better, because our nervous system is constantly monitoring the environment around us in order to prepare us for threats. So if it sees something in the audience that it thinks is an aggressive threat against us, it will accelerate us up through that traffic light from amber and potentially even to red. So our job is to manage it downwards.
Okay.
And you do that by understanding your own nervous system and how that works. But breathing is the number one, because you're kind of working in reverse to the nervous, because what the nervous system will do is it'll tell you to change your breathing because you're being threatened.
Yeah.
You'll take big gulps of breath to prepare yourself to run. So if you do a really deep out breath and you do really controlled breathing, weirdly it'll do the reverse and it'll calm your nervous system. So all the functions of the nervous system, hearing, sight, breathing, you can manage through all of those. So just opening your view of the room and just looking around it with a wide angle, again, calms your nervous system. Because your nervous system, if there's a tiger coming at you, it'll focus you on that single threat, so it narrows your field of vision. So opening relationally to the audience calms the nervous system, which is why I'd encourage a lot of people to if they can, maybe engage some of the audience.
Yes.
'Cause a lot of people find if they can ask a question and get into a relationship with people in the audience, they will relax.
Yes. And people normally smile at you when they see that you've noticed them. Then they smile at you, and then that makes it better anyway.
And that's, as you say, that's comforting, isn't it?
Yeah.
The worst thing is when you get everyone's looking at you sort of lost and aggressive.
Blank face.
Yeah.
Completely blank face.
And
or on their phone. You're scrolling on their phone,
And your trick is to not let that sort of thing panic you, but know how to deal with it. So I'd say calming the nervous system, breathing principally, but just managing your state. And I talk in the book about a situation where I had one of these huge events, and I counselled myself to not be sitting there in a panic in a corner, checking my slides, but rather going in and welcoming people as they came into the room, and actually put yourself on the front foot. Because if you've met half the people who are coming into the room, suddenly I find I'm much more relaxed. I know the room, I've walked round. I'm in a fundamentally different state than if I'm sitting in a corner worrying about my slides. And already my nervous system has got me. I'm not in as good a state as I could be if I was more welcoming.
And I think actually that's an interesting example, because I think that can be applied to networking as well, can't it? That thing, if you approach a given networking evening, rainy Thursday afternoon, and you arrive late and you feel as if you're on the kind of periphery of the room, then it's quite, you tend to kind of feel a bit closed in, and it makes it really hard to then talk to anybody.
Yeah.
But if you go in, maybe get there a little bit earlier and greet people as they come in, it just changes everything, doesn't it?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, your state and your attitude and the narrative you're telling yourself matters far more than we realise. So just changing that narrative that is going on in your head about what might happen and challenging it and saying, well, what evidence do I have for this state of mind that I'm in? Yeah, that reset can do everything. And I think also in networking, if you, again, back to the attachment thing, if you just say, I'm here to have a good time and I hope to meet one person, maybe, who I get on really well with, that's completely reframed what you think you're going to get out of the evening.
Yeah.
Because I think you'll be more open to the possibility of what is there for you as opposed to what you seek to get out of it.
Okay. Where does all this fear come from? I mean, is this all to do with being on the savannah, tigers, lions and gazelles?
I think
is that what's going on?
I think it does, yes. I mean, I think, let's face it, there's a very good function in us that is there to protect. And let's face it, the ego is trying to save us from loss and from essentially losing our lives. So there's a very good, solid, basic function there that's seeking to keep us safe physically from damage and death and all these threats that existed in this savannah-like world. The problem is that nowadays the ego is the thing that is seeking to protect us from anything.
Right.
Because the safest state for the ego is no change. It's comfort zone. It's nothing risky, which is kind of counter to everything most of us want to be doing in life.
Yes, yeah.
We want to be growing and changing and learning, but we've got this thing in us that wants to stop us from doing anything risky. And we've got to kind of understand that there's a reason why it does that. Kind of gives us that narrative that stepping outside our comfort zone is a bad thing, because it's attaching that to the age-old thing that if you stepped out of the crowd or out of the comfort zone in the savannah situation, you would be eaten.
Yeah.
Well, I put it to you that that's probably not going to happen in the average networking meeting today.
Let's hope.
Well.
So I've noticed recently a lot of people, and particularly there's a conversation that I've been picking up on LinkedIn, lots of people talking about imposter syndrome, so I thought this was a really good time to try and shed some light on that.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
What is it about? Well, it's part of that story, which is as soon as we step into somewhere where we don't feel comfortable, we feel like we shouldn't be there. But that's a combination of what the ego's telling us, which is a bit unuseful. But it's also a narrative we've chosen, we've been given. And I think we have a choice. We can either accept that narrative, which is essentially one that wherever I step into somewhere that is new or different, that would be providing me with growth, I feel like an imposter. You can, if you want, accept that narrative. And you can even normalise it, because the reality is, and this is what I used to do. One of the first things I do is get people to share how many people feel like that. And you realise there's something like 80% of the people in the room feel like that, because it's not just us, it's everyone. So you can normalise it and you can accept the narrative. But the reality is, I think it's open to us to shift the narrative. So if you think about comfort zone, if you literally think about my safe zone, the problem with staying in your comfort zone is that if you stay in your comfort zone, what actually happens is it doesn't stay the same size, it actually gets smaller.
Oh yes, yeah, good point.
Because if you literally think of yourself as somebody who's scared to go out of the house, and you lock the doors and you stay in your house, what will happen is you'll then start to be paranoid about all the things that might come and get you in the house. It's crazy. Those fears just get worse once you start to accept them. And weirdly, the only way to work with it is to step outside your comfort zone, maybe 1 foot at a time. If you step outside your comfort zone, that's the way to maintain and grow your comfort zone. So it's only by being a little bit uncomfortable at times that we get more comfortable. I mean, for example, when I first started doing this fear work, I distinctly remember, and I think it's useful to remind ourselves when things have changed, but I distinctly remember being really uncomfortable about doing a public workshop, about finding an event, putting it on Eventbrite and starting to publicise it, and the fear that no one would come. And that would make me really uncomfortable. And I've realised that it's only through doing it and taking that risk and saying, well, whoever will come, I'll accept that. It's only by doing it that I've started to get comfortable with that whole idea of putting on a workshop. And nowadays I feel completely differently about that thing. And it's interesting to observe that change and that shift, but it's only by stepping outside the house that you do that. So I think that the narrative, the changed story that's available to us is that if we all want to grow, we are going to have to put ourselves places where we feel discomfort. And that slightly discomforting feeling that we call imposter syndrome now is actually just something that we get when we're growing. So it's like being a sort of a plant or if we're growing in the natural world, accept that plants and trees and things, as they grow, they don't feel quite right. It feels uncomfortable to be moving into a space you haven't previously occupied. but that's okay. And I think we can tell ourselves that narrative because it's a much better narrative, because then we can help each other to all... What would it be like if we all supported each other in realising for all of us that feeling was a good thing? Great. Lucy, you're going to this thing, you're doing this talk, and you feel a little bit uncomfortable. That's great, because you're growing.
Yes.
Let's
just call it growing pains instead of imposter syndrome. There we go. Let's rebrand it.
Exactly.
It's a rebranding exercise.
You've got it. You've got it.
Other than that brilliant hack that we've managed to hack that on the spot, we've completely rebranded imposter syndrome. How, in more general terms, how can we hack our fear?
What surprised me, I talked earlier about this fear wall. I think we accept the labels for things, and we accept the labels for our fears far too readily. I talked earlier about the sort of difference between the label and the strategy. And I'll give you an example. So I worked with someone early on, and she was scared to go out of the house. And so the fear became going out of the house. And the realisation that wasn't the fear. It's a mislabeling because it's just a strategy for avoiding the fear. In the inquiry about the fear, what she learned in that example was that her fear was what would happen when she went up to her neighbours. She was worried about uncertainty and about the risk that they might not like her. And because if we start the inquiry about what our fears are, we start to get information about, there's a nuance there that we might not have accessed. And it's much easier to deal with that as a realisation, as an awareness, that actually my fear is just what might happen when I say hi to you, that you might not be nice to me. I can deal with that and test it and work through it in a way that if I think my fear is going out of the house, then that's much more difficult. So what I've learned is actually the first step is inquiry. It's a conversation. It's, get a friend to talk with you about the things you fear and ask those questions about, is that really what it is? Or is that something, that's just the sort of surface of it? And there's something deeper here. Because once we get more and more information about what we're really scared about, it probably connects to some things that might lie in our past. It's not that we're worried about this right now that's the problem. It's the fact that we've always been worried about it because of Uncle Joe, he used to scare us or something. And we can then see it for what it is rather than what we think it's become. So I think inquiry, learning, and then eventually there's a re-strategizing we can do, which is the reframing of our attitude and telling ourselves a different narrative and setting ourselves challenges. I mean, the reality is you can't grow confidence in a jar. You have to set yourself little challenges and go out and do things, but that's the way you grow. That's the way you grow confidence, is by doing something that's not crazy, but is a little bit scary. So it's through that route. And it's very difficult to be general about it too much, because I think it's very contextual and particular to all of us. And that's what surprised me, really, is not only the communality that we have in these things, but how particular everything is to context and every particular person, because we're all different.
But it sounds as though the thing that's always going to be a good step is just to stop and stare at it when you feel it. Stop and stare at it and think, why is this? Why do I feel like this?
Yeah.
Why is this so scary? I often, over the years, have had that thing where you're about to send out a proposal, going back to your kind of money example, and having that real kind of, I've read it and reread it and reread it so many times, but just pressing, and I would do a thing where I just press send and then just get up from the laptop and walk away, go into another room, put the kettle on, and then it's a weird thing. But I guess to think about why, to stop and think, why does that feel so uncomfortable? Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is trying to accept that our mind is a multi-layered thing. So there's a bit of us that wants to protect us, that in our mind, which isn't necessarily going to help us in all situations. So to be able to inquire of it and have a dialogue with that part of our mind, rather than just accepting it as a thing we have to do or have to obey, unquestionably. It's getting away from just thinking of ourselves as a yes or no machine. There's a complexity here that, if we go through it, makes the whole thing a lot more simple, weirdly.
Okay, so if there are listeners who are still with us and who are stuck with particular fears that are getting in the way and stopping them flourishing, how can they find out about a fear hacking workshop. So is that something that you do for companies or teams as a whole, or is it an individual thing? How does it work?
I've taken it to, I used to do it more as a public workshop, but I've now taken it to teams and groups. So really anyone who can constitute whether it's a corporate group or an organisation or just a bunch of people. If you can get a bunch of people together, I'm quite happy to come and do a workshop for a group. And it also morphs into, there's a wider conversation here about how do we create safe space, because psychological safety is critically important for any organisation. But I'm getting a lot of small businesses who know that in the creative sector that if they can transform this psychological safety, then we're all able to be more creative. So that's the kind of space it operates, but it segues into whole questions of leadership and teamwork and creativity. What I often do is morph the fear stuff into those wider questions to become a sort of different workshop about wider issues. But really just have a look at the website. I'm doing quite a few festivals this year. We'll have a thing called the Fear Wall, not the one we do with post-it notes in the moment, but I'm actually creating one that will be a festival piece, like a piece of artwork for the festival that people can contribute to, and kind of so we can see what the festival's fears are on that wall. So I'm experimenting with a few things like that because I think that the conversation needs to grow, because weirdly, once you name these things, you get free of fear, and that brings you to a place of hope. So weirdly, fear might sound like a negative thing, but it's actually a massively positive thing. So all those things, festivals, stuff I'm doing for organisations, I will probably put on a public thing towards the summer as well, which will go on the website.
Brilliant. Okay, well we'll link to all of that, and obviously, in true Small Spark Theory style, we're going to be giving away a copy of your book. In fact, why don't we give away a signed copy of your book? Brilliant. Okay. So, listeners, you know what to do. Join in the conversation on Twitter at Gunpowder Tweets using the hashtag Small Spark Theory, and we will pick a winner and send you a signed copy of Fear Hack. Hilary, you've been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for coming back and sharing your insights with us. Anybody listening, if you see me on a speaker platform this summer, be kind and smile at me from the audience. I'll really appreciate it. Thanks very much. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Small Spark Theory, brought to you by Gunpowder Consulting. Join in the conversation on Twitter at Gunpowder Tweets using the hashtag Small Spark Theory. This podcast is created and hosted by me, Lucy Mann, and edited and produced by Isabel Jarvis. Music is provided by Duke Deck, available at dukedeck.com, and this episode was recorded at The Pod at White City Place. For more information and to download further episodes, head to our blog at gunpowderconsulting.com. And if you like what you hear, head to iTunes and leave us a star.